It is my pleasure at this time to ask Dr. Samuel Gregg, who is the academic director of the Acton Institute, who himself earned his PhD in philosophy at Oxford University, to come and prepare us for the presentation of the 2007 Novak Award.
Thank you, Father. As many of you know, the Acton Institute maintains an extensive program of outreach to young scholars throughout the world who are pursuing study in the ideas that have contributed to the civilizational growth of the free and virtuous society, especially its commercial and economic components. Part of this program involves an annual award given to a young scholar who shows outstanding promise in promoting these ideas through rigorous academic research. This award is called the Novak Award and is named after the distinguished Catholic American theologian and economic thinker Michael Novak. Over the past years, the Novak Award has been given to young scholars from around the world, including from France, Poland, Australia, Singapore, and the United States. This year, we're pleased to say that the 2007 Novak Award has been awarded to a young German economist, Dr. Andrea Schneider, and her biographical details are contained in your program. One of the conditions attached to the Novak Award is that each awardee is required to deliver the Acton Institute's Callahan Lecture, which is named after the distinguished Catholic American businessman and philanthropist, Mr. Joseph Callahan. I have had the pleasure of knowing Dr. Schneider since she first attended one of the Acton's Free and Virtuous Society conferences back in the Czech Republic in 2001. Since that time, we have seen her develop from a young doctoral student wrestling with new ideas and a little uncertain about her future, into gaining her doctorate and winning several university prizes in the process, to becoming a senior researcher at one of Germany's leading think tanks, to her current position as an advisor to the office of the Federal Chancellor of Germany, Dr. Angela Merkel. Dr. Schneider is, I believe, a model of the type of young scholar that the Acton Institute wishes to promote, and I'm confident that her Callahan Lecture will reflect the tremendous scholarship and practical experience that she brings to her current position of high responsibility in Germany. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Andrea Schneider.
Father Sirico, dear friends of the Acton Institute, ladies and gentlemen, I feel very honored to have been rewarded with this Novak Award. It's been quite a exciting time and exciting message, and I'm really grateful because it gave me the opportunity to think back couple of years, and I would like to give you some personal reflections before I start my lecture. As a German who was raised up in the West, in Western Germany, I knew, nobody needed to tell me, that I was growing up on the better side of the two Germanys. It was just obvious, nobody needed to tell me. And I never really reflected on that. I knew democracy is good, social market economy is good, freedom is good, but I would not have been able to tell why. When I was 18 years old and I had to hand in a thesis for a school to get my A-levels, I was writing in the preface that for my generation, the separation of Germany is a fact and reunification is no more an option. That was just the way we were thinking in the generation. 2 years later, the wall came down. And this is what's possible. And we all know how much John Paul II had a hand in this and how many praise were necessary to get there. And by coincidence, I was in Berlin on the New Year's Eve of 89, 90. And it was just amazing to see that the doors were open, we could go into the East, and we were embracing each other and sharing drinks with each other and greeting, and it was just incredible how much joy there was. 10 years later, when we look back to reunification, United Germany, it is quite sad to realize, yes, we're united now, this is one Germany, there's freedom for all, democracy, social market economy, and so on, but there's so much to be done. And to have freedom alone, obviously, is not sufficient, because there's a lot of concern. How is it going to go on with this nation? We've seen a lot of dissatisfaction, of grumbling and nagging. There was high unemployment, and still is in the East, and I was really asking myself, what's happening here? I mean, they are free now, they should rejoice. They should rejoice to have the same good life we had before. And I really didn't understand what was going on. Then in 2001, when I was at the towards the Free and Virtuous Society conference, we were in Czech Republic and had a lot of friends from Hungary, Russia, Estonia, Poland, all these countries here. And it slowly dawned on me what was the problem. And it seemed to be the problem that we really need to understand what freedom is all about. Where does it come from? Why is it necessary to not only experience freedom, but to really savor it as a gift and really share a common idea of freedom? Know what is the foundation of it, and to know what is the foundation of a free society, and how to contribute myself to it. So I was really happy at this conference to be able to discuss all these questions with friends from the former UdSSR, and also I was just amazed of how many questions I had. Like, what does it do to these people? What did it do to them to be raised in a socialist system, in a system where churches were suppressed, where freedom, different areas were suppressed, and I couldn't stop asking questions, and I am still today. So what I really appreciate from the work from the Acton Institute is that they brought to my awareness how important it is to talk about these things, not to take them for granted. Yes, we're living in a free world, free society, democracy, market economies, but to really talk about it, to bring to our awareness why it is good for me, and why is it good to share these common ideas. So thank you not only for the award, but also for this opportunity to give me and other young scholars a platform to discuss it and to kind of travel also in our identity. For me as a German, it's really traveling into my identity, which is split for so many years. So what I would like to do now on this Callahan lecture is to go to the content of Centesimus Annus and try to interpret it in our time. With this conference, the Acton Institute recognizes the outstanding significance of a document that really belongs to the heart of Catholic social teaching. And the significance, as we heard today, really goes well beyond the Catholic Church and theology, and it goes well beyond the year of its publication, 1991. Centesimus Annus was a treasure of wisdom and knowledge, also for politicians and for economists, and it still is today. And I would like to give you now, from my perspective as an economist and also as a policy advisor, 4 different areas where I want to dwell on. So what do I perceive as an economist to be the fundamental insights? Why was John Paul II's teaching so highly significant? How can he help us to understand the present? And what can we learn from each other? I was told that there are quite a couple of different people here, theologians, historians, different sciences, and maybe not so many economists. So I will have to lead you a little bit into where I come from, what made my thinking. So let me go back in time. The father of economics, Adam Smith, was a British moral philosopher. In his first masterpiece, Theory of Moral Sentiments, he turned around the following questions. In which way does a human being act and react? What are his driving forces? What is his motivation to cooperate or to cheat? What are his basic incentives? And what restricts self-love, self-interest of man? What is the role of formal institutions, informal norms, customs, rules, short institutions? But above all was the question, what is the nature of man? So only after Adam Smith had found some insights into these questions, he then turned to his economic masterpiece, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. So only after he had found out about man's natural disposition to trade and to produce, to cooperate and compete, innovate and invest, to care and provide for his family, only then did he journey into the advantages of the division of labor on a national and international level. We owe Adam Smith the wonderful metaphor of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker, who prepare our dinner not by the benevolence from their own regard, from their regard to their, the brewer, the baker who prepare our dinner not from their benevolence, but from their regard to their own interest. The entrepreneur and every human is therein always restrained by four forces. And that is what Adam Smith developed in his Theory of Moral Sentiments. So it's the impartial spectator, what we call the conscience today. It is formal law, informal norms, traditions, institutions, and competition. That was his new contribution to that competition is a means to restrain self-interest, what Mr. Bischoff was pointing out before. The invisible hand became famous as a metaphor for the market mechanism, which coordinates individuals and their wishes and needs, demand and supply for the benefit of all. Had the philosophers of the ancient world been asking, what is a good and just landlord, and as Mr. Michelin put it, le bon père de la famille, and thereby laid out a rather thin line of economic thinking within ethics in the ancient world, Adam Smith fathered the economic science with the implicit question, what is a good and just economic order? In a world where individual had stepped out of the limitation of family, of social class and local boundaries, and thus out of the social control of moral behavior, Adam Smith was the first to develop a thorough institutional ethics of the economic sphere. Even better, he combined individual institutional ethics and individual ethics and outlined a moral and economic foundation of a free society. So this is the root of classic liberalism. Let me quote Jean-Paul II to summarize Adam Smith. It would appear that on the level of individual nations and of international relations, the free market is the most efficient instrument for utilizing resources and effectively responding to needs. So economics after Adam Smith took different turns and directions. It split up into branches and was a bit different in every country, but we can make some generalizations. But it was surely not very much longer concentrated on the question, which is the economic and social order that best suits man as we understand him, with his nature. And surely it wasn't related to other questions that arise, which role plays the individual, which the state, which the institutions, and which values do we want to be realized within these economic and social orders. To be more precise, even for many years, economics has been more a natural science, and it was using a lot of math and graphs and statistics and econometrics, and it was pretty much uninterested in the nature of man. So, however, it is still a social science, and whatever it did, implicitly and often unknowingly, it made certain statements about the nature of man, about the economic and social order, and about the inherent value system. And it took quite a while until economics turned back to all these questions, which are so fundamental. When in this preparation of the conference, I reread the encyclical Centesimus Annus after quite some time, I was really surprised and impressed by the clarity of the social and economic analysis of a theologian. We heard before that he didn't think himself to be a good economist, but I would like to make the point that I really would dare to say that John Paul II was a better economist than many I have read in the last 250 years. And I guess this is because, in at least my perception, because he really was an anthropologist and a philanthropist. So I was really impressed also how many answers I found in Centesimus Annus for the questions I have as an economist, as a policy advisor, as a Christian, but also as a German. So what are these fundamental insights of Centesimus Annus? I realized, first of all, that I cannot understand Centesimus Annus without reading Rerum Novarum before, because he was referring to it. So let's go back to this time. In the midst of the dramatic changes in the society and the economy of the late 19th century, the extremely quick industrialization and the impoverishment of vast parts of society, Leo XIII took a step back, looked at what happened, and made a real thorough analysis of the time in the light of the gospel. With a clear understanding for all areas of society and all classes within society, for the chances and for the dangers, and for the ideological alternatives, socialism and liberalism, he opened up a dialogue between the church and the modern world and discussed the moral and economic foundations of his society. The questions I had when I read Rerum Novarum was really, were the readers of the time aware of the prophetic dimension of his encyclical? And we must still be aware that socialism was rather a social philosophy at that time. It was not really a structured movement. So all of us being witnesses of the year 1989, we must be amazed on the depth of his insight. Laying out the Christian understanding of the nature of man, who's called to be free and to use this freedom based on reason and faith, Leo XIII rejected socialism and uncovered its underlying fatal mistake, which is anthropological in nature. Just as the moral philosopher Adam Smith looked at the human and his nature first and developed an economic system from this basis on, Leo XIII looked behind the existing system from this, to the core, the human. He unmasked socialism as an economic, social, and political system where, now I quote, the concept of the person as the autonomous subject of moral decision disappears. The person is suppressed by mechanisms of control, bureaucracy, and mistrust. The human being is robbed of its uniqueness and its unique dignity, as well as of its creativity and its responsibility. And human beings are robbed of the means of establishing a truly human community. John Paul II pointed out to us that, to quote, the main thread and guiding principle of Pope Leo's encyclical and of all of Church's social doctrine is a correct view of the human person. And Leo laid out general principles of how to use one's freedom. He was the one to develop the principles, to start with it, of solidarity and subsidiarity that are still valid until today. We see them being applied in the European Union, in the social market economy, in many discussions we have on the international level. So what is Rerum Novarum's message for us, or for me as an economist today? Well, first of all, only if we understand the nature of man, we're able to understand history, society, economy. Only in this way we can discern which economic and social for man. And only by knowing the nature of man we can find general principles and guidelines necessary to build a just society. Well, if you're a theologian here in the room, you might think this is obvious and this is a teaching fit for first semester students, so what's she talking about? But if you're an economist, you will not have heard this throughout all your studies. And it took me a whole dissertation to find all this out. And I would have loved to read Centesimus Annus before my studies. I doubt I would have really understood and grasped what it has to tell me. But well, it took me more than 10 years to really understand. So, however, at any stage in the development of the economic science, the concept of the person, although we're not aware of it, it has a strong impact on economics. It's the topics chosen, it's the conclusions drawn, it's the policy advices given. Everywhere you see the nature of man implied somehow. So maybe you might understand some statements of economists better now if you know now that they're not always aware of the concept of man. They have, and their policy advice might not really have a clear value system on the basis of it. In my introduction, I mentioned that the impact of Centesimus Annus goes well beyond theology. Well, the same is certainly true for Rerum Novarum and social teaching in general. And might also be interesting for you that the social teaching of the Church was highly influential for the foundation of the social market economy in Germany in the 1940s. There were a couple of circles of professors of law and economics meeting secretly, and they were discussing what to do, what is their responsibility as scientists in this Nazi regime. They were not all of them heroes. Some were active in resistance, some resisted passively, but they were really asking, what is our duty to do as Christians? Is it morally just or unjust to kill a dictator? And what could be a good economic and social order for the time after the Second World War? And they discussed a lot of social teaching at that time. There was bishops and theologians present, and so they did make a big impression of the social market economy. It was outlined as an idea in the 1940s. So what is the lasting significance of Centesimus Annus? Let us turn to John Paul II and Centesimus Annus. What makes it so significant even today? And why should it be part of first semester economics students' plan? When you listen to this, do not so much focus on the past and on communism, but have in mind the present capitalist systems. First of all, the core of Centesimus Annus is the human person. Just as much as Leo XIII and the Church was confronted with radical changes in the late 19th century, the same was true for John Paul II 100 years later. Industrialization, globalization, the fall of the Berlin Wall, collapse of communism, secularization, individualization, development gap between North and South, poverty in the South, this all is the scenery. Just as Leo XIII, John Paul II stepped back, looked at the development, and made a thorough analysis. Analyzing the reasons for the collapse of communism, he basically confirms Leo's analysis. And Leo's prediction have been confirmed by the event of 1989. Socialism failed. Why? Because it misjudged the nature of man. Its anthropological foundation was a deep mistrust in the human, a pessimistic view which could only lead into a totalitarian system where the interest of the individual is subordinated to the interest of all, where individual freedom is more and more repressed by forced rules and controls, where human rights are violated, the rights for free enterprise, for private property, and for freedom in the economic sphere. And we've seen it. It makes people passive. It discourages free initiative and creativity and the sense of achievement. In John Paul II's words, it denigrates the basic virtues of economic life, such as truthfulness, trustworthiness, and hard work. So does it ring a bell when you look at your country? Where the freedom of the person is thus violated, the social order cannot be stable in the long run. That was John Paul II saying. The collapse of communism has often been called the victory of freedom. Human rights and human nature cannot be suppressed forever. I'm glad we've seen that. Secondly, the importance of the right of economic initiative. Well, you only need to read German school books today to understand how important it was that John Paul II really made a very explicitly talked about the right of economic initiative. In a recent analysis of school books, it was shown that the overall very bad public reputation of entrepreneurs in Germany has one of its roots in children education. Because in all these books you can read explicitly or implicitly how many prejudices we have about entrepreneurs. It's all in there. And I don't believe that the teachers would point it out to the students that this might be a biased view. I'm sure that the children who are raised up with this will not really know that this is a value judgment applied on them. So they don't really have a choice. Contradicting all these widespread prejudices we have, or we hear, listen to in the public, John Paul II spoke of the human right of economic initiative and its positive contributions to society. Where critics of capitalism focus on the negative effects of competition between firms, like loss of jobs and unemployment, and on the distortion of virtues like greed and selfishness, John Paul II highlighted close collaboration within the firm, the important virtues which are fostered, such as diligence, industriousness, prudence in undertaking risks, reliability and fidelity in interpersonal relationships, courage to carrying out decisions which are really difficult and painful sometimes. So isn't that a contrast to the public debate? In his encyclical Sollicitudo Res Socialis, John Paul II described what is true for socialist and capitalist systems. Experience teaches us that the denial and restraint of the right of economic initiative will paralyze or destroy the spirit of entrepreneurship. The third insight, criticism of capitalism. Although John Paul II spoke up clearly for the positive potential of market economies, he disclosed the deficits also of modern capitalism in developing and developed countries, like consumerism, the inhumane exploitation of man, domination of things over person, poverty, lack of education for the poor, and so on. Well, the same is true in regard for the international division of labor. The access to markets and natural resources is not equally open for everybody and for every nation. And developed countries do play a main role in this because of their protectionist behavior, which has been pointing out this earlier. And this really covers all nations. No one can say, we're not part of this. Finally, he made it very clear that there are limits to the market and to the economy. I quote, "There are collective and qualitative needs which cannot be satisfied by market mechanism. Loving, belonging, being cared for, just to name some." I was very impressed, Mr. Bush, laying out this, looking at the enterprise as a family, and I felt like what I've written here might not be so reflected at all, because in my last appointments or jobs, I experienced friendship, and I experienced, say, a lot of personal care and interest. So I think the market mechanism, or it is a platform also to experience this, but it's not its first duty. Let's put it this way. What are the dangers of today's capitalism, as John Paul II was pointing out? It's exactly here where John Paul II saw a danger, that man chooses to idealize economy and the creation of wealth. And this criticism is not against market mechanism or capitalist system in general, but it is against an ethical and cultural system that forgets that the economy is one aspect of life. It is an important part, but is one part. I quote, "It is not wrong to want to live better. What is wrong is a style of life which is presumed to be better when it is directed towards having rather than being." So my fifth point, the problem of the welfare state. One of the big dangers John Paul II identified concerns the role of the state, and we've heard about this before. He acknowledged its important role to set up an institutional framework that guarantees individual freedom and private property, stable currency, and efficient public services. So far, I think everybody here would agree. But I think that many politicians in many Western capitalist systems would be amazed to read his criticism of the so-called welfare state. A state that takes upon him responsibilities which are genuine competences of individuals, families, neighborhoods, and other social units. It is thereby exaggerating its role and distorts the principle of subsidiarity. If the state intervenes directly, this welfare state discourages human initiative and energies. And by offering material assistance in a humiliating way, the welfare state reduces the needy to mere objects of assistance without helping them to really escape their precarious situation by promoting their dignity as persons. This type of the state stands in the way of families and social networks that can offer solidarity and familiarity instead of disintegration and anonymity. So including this part, let me summarize. What's the core of John Paul II's criticism on today's capitalism? Well, what I perceive to be this core would be the separation of freedom and truth. It is a concept of freedom that is not bound to truth, but to self-interest, self-love, and arbitrary criteria of justice. Looking at these deep insights and taking into account how little economists have been thinking about the human person and its rights throughout the 20th century, you will understand that my introductory remarks that John Paul II is a better economist than many I've read. Just as Adam Smith did 250 years ago, who started from the person and from his nature, John Paul II did just the same. And this has been really forgotten for many decades in economics, and it has impoverished economics and economic policy. It still does for vast parts of economics. Because John Paul II and the Church social doctrine fully incorporates the teaching of economics, for example, the role of property, of human capital, or the market, it prepares the ground for dialogue. It offers its insight into the nature of man, into the moral foundation of society, and can thus lead economic policy into deeper ethical reflection. So what is the message of Centesimus Annus for us today? We can pick a lot of topics. I want to pick just some I found interesting. Globalization, for example. Well, how do we react to globalization? We all know it has been accelerated after the fall of communism, and more countries have been coming. China was mentioned before, India, Brazil, Russia, many small Asian countries access the marketplace. The transformation already is quite on the way. China is learning. Right? Levels of GDP are rising, poverty indicators are going down. But what really startles me is how little we hear about what an incredible big opportunity for development this is, how good this is for the individual. For millions of Chinese and Indians who have been subject to our bilateral and multilateral development strategies only a while ago. So not everybody in these countries is well off already. That is a fact, okay, but there are more people well off than there were only 5 or 10 years ago. Before we had a development strategy which was favored by economists, it was trade, not aid. Saying, let them come on the market and that you will see the development takes its rise. This was the predominant strategy for us, for the Western world. Now we see it coming true in these countries, but not because we help them, because out of their own strength now develop. But what happens? Are we glad about this development in the Western world? I think we really have to be honest with ourselves and see that we're afraid of what's happening. We're afraid that this is going to take away our wealth and our prosperity. And we're no longer so glad to talk about trade, not aid. We really are afraid of new big competitors and their huge appetite for resources. And we see that the balances of powers are changing. That is frightening. So it's a strange sort of ethics to feel good about the money we spend on Christmas for developing countries, but to raise barriers of trade once they really try to develop. Seeing this in the light of Centesimus Annus, we must recognize the flat world is a challenge to the developed countries, which can help us to rediscover our important virtues in economic life, such as entrepreneurship. And the flat world is a big chance for peace and development. Let's hear John Paul II on this. The other name for peace is development. Just as much as there is a common responsibility to prevent wars, there's a common responsibility to assist development. So let us not waste time in fear, but instead think about ways and means to use this opportunity for international cooperation, for the support of human rights, and for peace. A second topic I want to raise, the basic mistake of the welfare state. John Paul II was highlighting it. Today we see in all varieties of capitalism different ways of how to balance the efficiency of the market and solidarity with the poor. That's a good thing. But this seems to be exactly the weak spot of capitalist system and the reason why many turned into welfare states. Why? Because you need a real sound understanding of the person to do this right. The general mistake in Germany, for example, is that citizens as well as state officials favor security to freedom. The level of justice of the social market economy is defined by the level of transfer payments and by the degree of income equality. The more the state is spending on social policy for those in need, the more it is a just society. But what an illusion. Solidarity is delegated away from the family to the state, and justice is narrowed in its definition to be just justitia distributiva. Also, subsidiarity is defined as efficiency. If the individual or the family cannot solve a problem effectively, the way the state defines effectiveness, the state steps in. Instead of designing institutions and incentives that strengthen the good and virtuous in man, legislation and bureaucracy is designed to replace individual moral judgment and decision-making. But however, a purely institutional morality undermines the foundation of morality, which is voluntariness and a sense of responsibility. We use the term creeping socialism for what happens in Germany. But at the core of the problem really is the same misjudgment of the nature of the person. And the result is a constant need for even more and more security. And the result is a culture of indifference, envy, disencouragement of entrepreneurs, and so on. What is John Paul II's message for us today? Although a certain amount of equality is indispensable for every society, it cannot be created by the state by the means of income distribution. Instead of idealizing equity, the Church offers the option for the poor. It offers caritas, it offers individual solidarity. The design of policies, for example, labor market policies, should take this into consideration. Solidarity is no one-way street. There's a responsibility we have for the poor and the weak, but there's also a responsibility of the poor and the weak to do what they can for the good of all. The state has a very important role, especially in designing institutions for the community, but the power of the state needs restriction within healthy limits. The Church and its teaching encourage us to use our freedom, knowing that there is no such thing as total security. Failure is possible, and it is a normal part of our life, but it is not the end of life. It makes us human, it makes us humble, it makes us generous. The spirit of the entrepreneur cannot be extinguished. That's one of the points I learned from Centesimus Annus and that I learn when I go through Berlin. An economy like the German is a rather status quo-oriented economy. Rules are made for insiders, for the establishment, which avoid risk, which try to keep the jobs that are already existent, that save the structures of production methods we already used in the last 10 years. And these rules keep out freakish, risk-taking young people who might want to restructure, to recreate, to reinvent economy and society and to do it different. Well, in Germany, we do for people what they can do for themselves. We substitute family with state, never informal norm. As soon as we find one, it's formalized and legalized. In a society where an economy where outsiders and freaks have no chance, we'll see what happened in the Buddenbrook family that Thomas Mann has been writing about. Well, the first generation builds up the business or whatever it is, the second consolidates, and the third lives on the heritage poorly. However, in Germany and elsewhere, we also see that it is true what John Paul II said: the right of freedom and spirit of entrepreneurship cannot be suppressed in the long run. If you walk through East Berlin, you'll see so many new stores, so many new ideas, so many new enthusiastic young people that just start their own business. They have very little knowledge. They just have an idea and they go for it. They don't even want to get rich. They just have an idea they think that might work and they really want to see it unfold. So it cannot be suppressed, and they really have to meet high bureaucratic burden. There's another recent development I would like to highlight on the ground of John Paul II. Only in the last 10 to 15 years, some economists started to doubt what had been the paradigm for decades, that GDP and economic growth rates is what matters most, that growth should therefore be the most important political end. We've done some opinion surveys, and they have discovered that although GDP is still on the rise in developed countries, happiness isn't. When after World War II, the worst economic and social crisis in the Western European world was overcome, happiness stopped to grow along with GDP. For decades now, it has been more or less stable, and economics call this the paradox of happiness and ask, why does growth fail to make us happier? Economics has rediscovered its origin as a social science and now tries to find out what's behind this paradox. A recent survey distinguishes happy varieties of capitalism, like in the US, in Great Britain, Canada, Australia, or Netherlands, a less happy variety of capitalism, like in Germany, Spain, France, and an unhappy variety, sorry to say, in Italy, Portugal, and Greece. The happiest countries all show a bundle of characteristics: high levels of trust in people, high levels of economic freedom, low levels of corruption, low level of shadow economy, low levels of unemployment, and of low levels of labor protection, high income, high educational standards, high birth rates, and so on. Well, from a classical point of view, classic liberal point of view, that's not surprising. And it's also not surprising having read Rerum Novarum Centesimus Annus. But it must be surprising for socialists and for all those who favor equality higher than freedom and who define equality as income equality, or who are in favor of the all-inclusive welfare state. What idea of man is implied in this new approach? Is it another anthropological mistake of man's search for the meaning of life? The interest in happiness is not only a phenomenon of economics or politics. Downshifting is the term used to describe a new trend we see in the US, but also in other European countries. More and more young, successful people break out of their 60, 70, 90 hours job and cut down. They want to live their lives. They want to do what they really want, do something that they value as to be more meaningful. So in my perspective, these two developments, that we look at happiness in economic research and that people start to look at their own happiness, is a step forward. It's a step beyond the narrow focus on GDP and on personal wealth accumulation. It might be a more holistic approach to the individual and its well-being. And it is a window of opportunity for the church to help people to answer their question. How do I want to live? What does happiness mean for me personally? However, John Paul II teaches me to see a danger too. Economics, politics, and individuals might have discovered a new idol, because happiness is not to be confused with salvation. Christian theology never preached happiness as the highest value, the purpose in life. Even if in the prophet Jeremiah read, I want your happiness and not to harm you, we would never conclude Jesus died that I could live happily ever after. What does Scripture tell us about a happy life? Well, in this house, I don't need to talk a lot about this. You know it. It's the 10 Commandments, the commandment of loving our neighbors, and so on. All these gifts we are given from God, they teach us that life is about more. It's about healing of the whole person, and even more. John Paul II in Centesimus Annus pointed out that the social teaching of the Church is aimed at helping man on the path of salvation. So what happens in a society that declares happiness to be the highest end? Is it a neo-hedonistic society, a neo-utilitarianist society? That's difficult. A more human society? The common good in the Christian meaning is not thinkable without the concept of personal sacrifice. Has this a place in a happy society? Well, I hope that the Church will look at this very closely and get into a dialogue.